I'm Hiram Chodash, Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. Welcome to the next exciting phase on values and violence, and in particular the S.J. Quinney College of Law lecture by Professor Martha Nussbaum. I stand here with Dean Steve Ott, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Based on the outstanding work of his Associate Dean Steve Reynolds, my colleague Wayne McCormick, Ibrahim Karwan of the Middle East Center, and Dean Chatterjee of the Philosophy Department, as well as innumerable departments throughout the university, we stand together, united as key partners in this conference and its outstanding cast and contributions. The College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Tanner Center, and the Quinney Foundation through the College of Law have all made generous contributions to this project, and we are very, very thankful. Dean Ott and I share President Young's and the broader community's commitment to work across disciplines in order to contribute insights that might help improve the human condition. Before Dean Ott gives you a more detailed introduction of our speaker's amazing accomplishments, I'd like to explain briefly why I think Professor Nussbaum was the perfect choice today in pursuit of our broader mission. She's perfect for this role, not only because she's a teacher, a philosopher teaching in a law school, for really all philosophers should teach in law schools, but more importantly, because she's perfect for this role because of her commitment and brilliant pursuit of the idea that philosophy should matter as a tool in the improvement of the world both within and around us. Indeed, that philosophers should be, in Professor Nussbaum's own words, lawyers for humanity. So thank you all for joining us for this lecture. And as Dean Ott will continue with the introduction of Professor Martha Nussbaum, our distinguished lawyer for humanity. Thank you.
And I would like simply one clarification. We have two wonderful Tanner Centers at this university. One is the Tanner Humanities Center. The other that I would like to make sure that you're aware of, because it's new in this last year, is the Barbara and Norman Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy. And that is the group that is active in this one. I don't want to minimize the contributions of the other one, but it's the Barbara and Norman Tanner Center involved in this one. I join with my colleague Dean Chodash in thanking Professor Nussbaum for being with us today. You never want to say the most, but perhaps the most important philosopher and public intellectual of the current time. We are so proud to have her here. I have to read, and I can only read some, otherwise she would never talk. She is the Ernst Freud Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago, with appointments, as was mentioned, in philosophy, law, and also divinity. She is the founder and coordinator of the new Center for Comparative Constitutionalism. She has also taught at Harvard, Oxford, Brown universities, and is currently a visiting professor at Harvard in spring 2007. Among her other past accomplishments, Professor Nussbaum has been a member of the Council of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the Board of the American Council of Learned Societies, research advisor at the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association. She's the current president of the Human Development and Capability Association. She has received honorary degrees from over 30 colleges and universities in the United States, Canada, Asia, and Europe. She is the author of over 15 books, and I'm not going to read the titles for you. She has forthcoming books and more under contract. I can only say that we are privileged and honored to have Professor Martha Nussbaum as our speaker tonight.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Utah. I've always enjoyed my many visits here. And so what I'm going to talk about today, it's drawn from a book of mine that will come out in April, which is somewhat of a change of pace because as a result of doing work on the philosophical foundations of development in India, I got drawn into the political events and decided to write something for the American public about what moral one might draw from those events. So that's what I've done. On February 27th, 2002, the Sabarmati Express train arrived in the station of Godhra in the state of Gujarat, bearing a large group of Hindu pilgrims who were returning from a pilgrimage to the alleged birthplace of the god Rama, where some years earlier, angry Hindu mobs had destroyed the Babri Mosque, which they claim is on top of the remains of Rama's birthplace. The pilgrimage, like many others in recent times, aimed at forcibly constructing a Hindu temple over the disputed site, and the mood of the returning passengers, frustrated in their aims by the government and the courts, was angry. When the train stopped at the station, passengers got into arguments with Muslim vendors and passengers. At least one Muslim vendor was beaten up when he refused to say, "Hail Ram." As the train left the station, stones were thrown at it, apparently by Muslims. 15 minutes later, one car of the train erupted in flames. 58 men, women, and children died in the fire. Most of the dead were Hindus. Because the area adjacent to the tracks was an area of Muslim dwellings, and because a Muslim mob had gathered in the region to protest the treatment of Muslims on the train platform, blame was immediately put on Muslims. Many people were arrested, and some of these are still in detention today without charge, despite the fact that 2 independent inquiries into the event have established through careful sifting of the forensic evidence that the fire was most probably a tragic accident caused by combustion from cook stoves carried on by the passengers and stored under the seats of the train. In the days that followed, wave upon wave of violence swept through the state. The attackers were Hindus, many of them highly politicized, shouting Hindu right-wing slogans such as "Hail Ram," along with "Kill, Destroy, Slaughter." There's copious evidence that the violence was planned in a way before the event. Hindu extremist organizations had lists of Muslim dwellings that they circulated well in advance of the precipitating event. No one was spared. Young children were burnt along with their families. Particularly striking was the number of women who were raped, mutilated, and in some cases tortured with large metal objects and then set on fire. Over the course of several weeks, about 2,000 Muslims were killed. Children were killed with their parents. Fetuses were ripped from the bellies of pregnant women to be tossed into the fire. Most alarming was the total breakdown in the rule of law, not only at the local level, but also that of state and national government. Police were ordered not to stop the violence. Some even egged it on. Gujarat's Chief Minister Narendra Modi rationalized and encouraged the murders. He was later re-elected on a platform that focused on religious hatred. Because evidence of Modi's criminal activity is so overwhelming, he has been denied a visa to enter the United States. Meanwhile, the national government showed a culpable indifference. Prime Minister Vajpayee suggested that religious riots were inevitable wherever Muslims live alongside Hindus, and the troublemaking Muslims were to blame. Leading politicians implied that government would from thenceforth treat citizens unequally. Some would receive the full protection of the law, and others would not. While Americans have focused on the war on terror, Iraq, and the Middle East, democracy has been under siege in another part of the world. India, the most populous of all democracies, and a country whose constitution protects human rights even more comprehensively than our own, has been in crisis. Until the spring of 2004, its parliamentary government was increasingly controlled by right-wing Hindu extremists who condone and in some cases actively support violence against minorities, especially the Muslim minority. Many seek fundamental changes in India's pluralistic democracy. Despite their recent electoral loss, these political groups and the social organizations allied with them remain extremely powerful. Democracy and the rule of law have shown impressive strength and resilience, but the future is unclear. What has been happening in India is a serious threat to the future of democracy in the world. The fact that it has yet to make it onto the radar screen of many Americans is evidence of the way in which terrorism and the war on Iraq have distracted Americans from events and issues of fundamental significance. If we really want to understand the impact of religious nationalism on democratic values, India currently provides a deeply troubling example, and one without which any more general understanding of the phenomena is dangerously incomplete. It also provides an example of how democracy can survive the assault of religious extremism. In May 2004, the voters of India went to the polls in large numbers. Gujarat as a lens through which to conduct a critical examination of the influential thesis of the clash of civilizations made famous by Samuel Huntington. Huntington's picture of the world as riven between democratic Western values and an aggressive Muslim monolith does nothing to help us understand today's India, where the violent values of the Hindu right are imports from European fascism of the 1930s, and where the third largest Muslim population in the world lives in peace despite severe poverty and other inequalities. Through a study of this case, I'll argue that the real clash of civilizations is not the clash between Islam and the West, but instead a clash within virtually all modern nations, namely between people who are prepared to live with others who are different on terms of equal respect, and those who seek the protection of homogeneity and the domination of a single, pure religious and ethnic tradition. At a deeper level, my thesis is the Gandhian claim that the real clash of civilizations is actually a clash within the individual self, between the urge to dominate and defile the other, and a willingness to live respectfully on terms of compassion and equality, with all the vulnerability that such a life entails. This argument about India will also suggest a way to see America, which is also torn between two different pictures of itself. One picture shows America and Americans as good and pure, its enemies as an external axis of evil. The other picture, the fruit of internal self-criticism, shows America to itself as complex and flawed, torn between forces bent on control and hierarchy, and forces that promote democratic equality. At a deeper level, what I've called the Gandhian level, my internal clash picture shows Americans to themselves as people each of whom is probably capable of both respect and aggression, both democratic mutuality and anxious domination. As George Kennan wrote, "I wish I could believe that the human impulses which give rise to the nightmares of totalitarianism were ones which Providence had allocated only to other peoples, and to which the American people had been graciously left immune. Unfortunately, I know this is not true. The fact of the matter is that there's a little bit of the totalitarian buried somewhere way down deep in each and every one of us." My argument then is focused on India, but it is also pertinent to other countries. For, as Nehru said on the eve of India's independence, all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart. According to the Huntington thesis, each civilization has its own rather unitary, distinctive view of the world, and Hinduism counts as a distinct civilization. If we investigate the history of the Hindu right, however, we will see a very different story emerging. Traditional Hinduism was decentralized, plural, and highly tolerant, so much so that the vision of a unitary, pure Hinduism that could provide the new nation with an aggressive ideology of homogeneity could not be found in India at all. The founders of the Hindu right had to import it from Europe. Today, European fascism is seated right at the heart of what parades, in some quarters at least, as Hindu civilization. The Hindu right's version of history is a simple one. Like all simple tales, it is largely a fabrication, but its importance to the movement may be seen by the intensity with which its members go after scholars who present a more nuanced and accurate view of history, not only by strident public critiques, but by organized campaigns of threat and intimidation, culminating in some cases in physical violence. So here's how the concocted story goes. Once there lived in the Indus Valley a pure and peaceful people. They spoke Vedic Sanskrit, a language revealed as that of the gods when the immortal Vedas were given to humanity. They had a rich material culture, well suited to sustain their prosperous life. Despite their peaceful temper, they were also well prepared for war. They had chariots and even horses. Their realm was vast, stretching from Kashmir in the north to Sri Lanka in the south. And yet they saw unity and solidarity in their shared ways of life, calling themselves Hindus and their shared land Hindustan. No class divisions troubled them, nor was caste a painful source of division. The condition of women was excellent. This peaceful condition went on for centuries, although from time to time marauders made their appearance at this people's doorstep, for example the Huns. They were quickly dispatched because this people was aggressive when it needed to be, and its warlike strength was feared far and wide. Suddenly, rudely, unprovoked, invading Muslims put an end to all that. The early medieval period saw brief incursions by Muslims bent on the destruction of Hindu temples. These, however, proved short-lived. Disaster struck with a heavier hand, however, when Babur swept through the north of Hindustan early in the 16th century, vandalizing Hindu temples, stealing sacred objects, building mosques over temple ruins. For 200 years, Hindus lived at the mercy of the marauders until the Maharashtrian hero Shivaji rose up against the aliens and drove them back, restoring the Hindu kingdom. His success, however, was all too brief. Soon, the British East India Company, and then the British themselves, took up where Babur and his progeny had left off, imposing a tyranny upon Hindustan and her people. In short, despite the flawless excellence of indigenous Hindu culture, the men of Hindustan have lived for centuries in a humiliated condition. They can recover pride in themselves only by concerted aggression against alien elements in their midst. Then, they can recapture the time when Rama ruled the world with his blessings. What is wrong with this picture? Well, for a start, the people who spoke Sanskrit almost certainly migrated into the subcontinent from outside, finding indigenous people there, probably the ancestors of the Dravidian people of South India. Hindus are no more indigenous than Muslims. Second, it leaves out problems in Hindu society. The problem of caste, which both Gandhi and Tagore took to be the central social problem facing India, and obvious problems of class and gender inequality. When historians point to evidence of these things in ancient times, they call them Marxists, as if that by itself invalidated the arguments. Third, it leaves out the tremendous regional differences within Hinduism, and hostilities and aggressions sometimes associated with those, as Hindus vandalized Hindu temples in many cases. Fourth, it omits the evidence of peaceful coexistence and syncretism between Hindus and Muslims for a good deal of the Mughal Empire, including Akbar's well-known policies of religious pluralism. Muslims are, in this story, nothing but bad and aggressive. In the Hindu right version of history, a persistent theme is that of humiliated masculinity. According to the received story, Hindus have been subordinate for centuries and their masculinity insulted, in part because they have not been aggressive and violent enough. Even while the violence of the conquerors is decried, Hindu males are encouraged to emulate that aggressive and warlike behavior. Rabindranath Tagore, deeply perceptive here as always, represents his Hindu nationalist anti-hero in the novel The Home and the World as wishing he could seize the woman he desires by force, but finding that he cannot actually do so. He blames this inability on his Hindu heritage and wishes for a different nature. He says that there are two different sorts of music, the sound of the Hindu flute and the sound of the British military band. He wishes he could hear in his blood the sound of the military band rather than that disturbingly sensuous and non-aggressive flute. The two leading ideologues of the Hindu right, who in different ways responded to this call for a warlike Hindu masculinity, are V.D. Savarkar, a freedom fighter who spent years in a British prison in the Andaman Islands, and who may have been a co-conspirator in the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, and M.S. Golwalkar, a guru-like figure who was not involved in the independence struggle and who quietly behind the scenes built up the organization called the RSS, meaning National Corps of Volunteers, that is now the leading social organization of the Hindu right. Savarkar's book, Hindutva, Who is a Hindu, first published in 1923, undertakes to define the essence of Hinduness for the new nation. His definition is exclusionary, emphasizing cultural homogeneity and the need to use force to ensure the supremacy of Hindus. For reason of time, however, I will focus on Gawarkar's book, We, or Our Nationhood Defined, published in 1939. Some of the remarks I'm about to quote are deeply embarrassing to Hindus on the right today, and members of the Hindu right hasten to assure one that Gawarkar knew nothing about the Holocaust and withdrew the offending statements in editions published after the war. But remember, 1939 was still after the Nuremberg Laws and Kristallnacht, and my own copy of the fourth edition of We, published in 1947, still contains the statements that I shall quote here. Writing during the independence struggle, Gawarkar sees his task as describing the unity of the new Indian nation. He announces that most Indians' ideas about nationhood are mistaken. Quote, they are not in conformity with those of the Western political scientists. It is but proper, therefore, to understand what the Western scholars state as the universal nation idea and correct ourselves. With this end in view, we shall now proceed with stating and analyzing the world's accepted nation concept. So notice the unself-conscious deference to European scholarship as what the world thinks. Gawarkar now turns to English dictionaries and to British and German political scientists. The 5 elements that he finds repeated as hallmarks of national unity are geography, race, religion, culture, and language. Gawarkar examines each of these in turn and then analyzes several nations to see to what extent they embody the desired unity. Germany impresses him especially for the way in which it has managed to bring, quote, under one sway the whole of the territory, end quote, that was originally held by the Germani, but that was parceled out under different regimes. Turning to race, he now observes, quote, German race pride has now become the topic of the day. To keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by her purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Race pride at its highest has been manifested here. Germany has also shown how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to the root to be assimilated into one united whole, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by. In the end, Gawarkar's vision of national unity is not exactly that of Nazi Germany. He is not very concerned with purity of blood, and far more concerned with the group's desire to merge into the dominant whole. Groups who fall outside the 5-fold definition of nationhood, he concludes, can, quote, have no place in the national life unless they abandon their differences and completely merge themselves in the national race. So long, however, as they maintain their racial, religious, and cultural differences, they can but be only foreigners who may be either friendly or inimical to the nation, end quote. So unlike Hitler, Gawarkar would probably be happy with the conduct of the many German Jews who converted to Christianity and assimilated their lifestyle to the dominant German lifestyle. Nonetheless, he is firmly against the civic equality of any people who retain their religious and ethnic distinctiveness, refusing to merge into the dominant Hindu whole. He speaks approvingly of the idea that people who refuse to assimilate will lose their civil rights, living, quote, at the sufferance of the nation and deserving of no special protection, far less any privileges or rights. And here is the way in which Gawarkar applies his ruminations about the nations of Europe to the case of India. There are only 2 courses open to the foreign elements, either to merge themselves in the national race and adopt its culture, or to live at the sweet will of the national race. That is the only logical and correct solution. That alone keeps the nation safe from the danger of a cancer developing in its body politic, of the creation of a state within the state. From this standpoint, sanctioned by the experiences of shrewd old nations, the non-Hindu peoples in Hindustan must either adopt the Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must entertain no idea but those of glorification of the Hindu race and culture. In one word, they must cease to be foreigners, or they may stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, not even citizens' rights. There is, at least should be, no other course for them to adopt. At this time, the RSS, Gawarkar's organization, was a cultural movement without a distinct political arm. It disavowed connection with the more political Hindu Mahasabha, which later did propose, in fact, that Muslims and Christians would lose all civil rights in the new nation. Clearly, however, that is Golwalkar's program, and we should not doubt that such aims lie underneath the modern political arm of the RSS, namely the political party known as the BJP. At the time of independence, such ideas of Hindu supremacy did not prevail. Nehru and Gandhi insisted not only on equal rights for all citizens, but also on stringent protections for religious freedom of expression in the new constitution. Gandhi always pointedly included Muslims at the very heart of his movement. A devout Muslim, Maulana Azad, was one of his and Nehru's most trusted advisors, and it was to him that Gandhi turned to accept food when he broke his fast unto death, a very pointed assault on sectarian ideas of purity and pollution. His pluralistic ideas, however, were always contested. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was shot at point-blank range by Nathuram Godse, member of the Hindu Mahasabha and former member of the RSS. Godse, who edited a newspaper called Hindu Rashtra, meaning Hindu Nation, had left the RSS because it seemed to him not political enough. The Mahasabha, a political party, was more congenial. Godse had long had a close relationship with Savarkar, whom he revered. Since the time you were released from your internment at Ratnagiri, he wrote to him in a letter, a divine fire is kindled in the minds of those groups who profess that Hindustan is for the Hindus. He spoke of using the Hindu Mahasabha, of which Savarkar was then president, to build a national volunteer army using the resources of the RSS, where he was a leading organizer. At his sentencing on November 8, 1949, Godse read a book-length statement of self-explanation justifying his assassination for posterity. Although the statement was not permitted publication at the time, it gradually leaked out into the public domain. Today, it is widely available on the internet, where Godse is something of a hero in Hindu right websites. Revered, and on one website entirely devoted to his career is called The True Patriot and The True Indian. Godse's self-justification, like the historical accounts of both Savarkar and Golwalkar, sees recent events against the backdrop of centuries of Muslim tyranny, that's a quote, punctuated by the heroic resistance of Shivaji, the 18th century rebel. Like Savarkar, he describes his goal as that of creating a strong, proud India that can throw off centuries of domination. Godse is appalled by Gandhi's rejection of the warlike heroes of classical Hindu epics. It is my firm belief, he writes, that in dubbing Rama, Krishna, and Arjuna as guilty of violence, the Mahatma betrayed a total ignorance of the springs of human action. Indeed, he argues, it is Gandhi who is the more guilty of violence, since he exposes Indians to subordination and humiliation. Quote, he was, paradoxical as it may appear, a violent pacifist who brought untold calamities on the country in the name of truth and nonviolence, while Shivaji will remain enshrined in the hearts of his countrymen forever for the freedom he brought to them. So deep was Godse's objection to nonviolence that he refused the offer to commute his sentence to life imprisonment, saying, please see to it that mercy is not imposed on me. I want to show that through me, Gandhiji's nonviolence is being hanged. Godse's second major objection to Gandhi is to Gandhi's respectful inclusion of Muslims as full citizens in the new nation, which Godse calls his pro-Muslim policy. Godse tells us that he gradually came to the conclusion that Gandhi's, to him, disastrous policies could only be brought to an end by ending Gandhi's life. Such was Gandhi's personal charisma, that so long as he lived, the Congress Party would have to, quote, be content with playing second fiddle to all his eccentricity, whimsicality, metaphysics, and primitive vision, end quote. Gandhi's, quote, childish insanities and obstinacies, coupled with a most severe austerity of life, ceaseless work, and lofty character, made Gandhi formidable and irresistible, end quote. So, he says, he went to work planning in secret and then fired the fateful shots. Toward the end of Godse's statement appears a passage that heads the Hindu Right website devoted to his memory. If devotion to one's country amounts to a sin, I admit that I have committed that sin. If it is meritorious, I humbly claim the merit thereof. I fully and confidently believe that if there be any other court of justice beyond the one founded by the mortals, my act will not be taken as unjust. If after the death there be no such place to reach or go to, there is nothing to be said. I have resorted to the action I did purely for the benefit of humanity. I do say that my shots were fired at the person whose policy and action had brought wrack and ruin and destruction to tens of thousands of Hindus. Now, Nehru believed that the murder of Gandhi was part of what he called a fairly widespread conspiracy on the part of the Hindu right to seize power. He saw the situation as analogous to that in Europe on the eve of the fascist takeovers. And he believed that the RSS was the real power, not the more political Hindu Mahasabha, but the RSS was the real power behind this conspiracy. In December 1947, Nehru had already written to the provincial governors as follows: "We have a great deal of evidence to show that the RSS is an organization which is in the nature of a private army and which is definitely proceeding along the strictest Nazi lines, even following their techniques of organization. I have some knowledge of the way the Nazi movement developed in Germany." Now, for reasons of time, we must now fast forward to more recent years. Although illegal for a time, the RSS eventually reemerged and quietly went to work building a vast social network consisting largely of groups for young boys, which are called branches or shakas, which, through clever use of games and songs, indoctrinate the young into the confrontational and Hindu supremacist ideology of the organization. The idea of total obedience and the abnegation of the critical faculties is at the very core of this solidaristic movement. Each day, as RSS members raise the saffron flag of the warlike hero Shivaji, which the movement prefers to the tricolor flag of the Indian nation with its Buddhist wheel of law reminding citizens of the Emperor Ashoka's devotion to religious toleration, they recite the following pledge, quote, "I take the oath that I will always protect the purity of Hindu religion and the purity of Hindu culture for the supreme progress of the Hindu nation. I have become a component of the RSS. I will do the work of the RSS with utmost sincerity and unselfishness, and with all my body, soul, and resources. And I will keep this vow for as long as I live. Victory to Mother India." The organization also makes clever use of modern media. A nationally televised serial version of the classic epic Ramayana in the late 1980s fascinated viewers all over India with its concocted tale of a unitary Hinduism dedicated to the single-minded worship of the god Rama and to his birthplace at Ayodhya in northern India. As a result of the propaganda stirred up in this and other ways, in 1992, Hindu mobs, with the evident connivance of the modern political wing of the RSS, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, destroyed a mosque in the city of Ayodhya that they said covers the remains of the Hindu temple that marked Rama's birthplace. Meanwhile, politically, the BJP began to gather strength in the late 1980s, drawing on widespread public dissatisfaction with the economic policies of the post-Nehru Congress Party, although it was actually Congress under Rajiv Gandhi that began economic reforms. And playing, as always, the cards of hatred and fear. It was during their ascendancy in a coalition government that prevented them from carrying out all of their goals that the destruction of the Ayodhya mosque took place. The violence in Gujarat 10 years later was the culmination of a series of increasingly angry pilgrimages to the Ayodhya site, where the Hindu right has kept trying to construct a temple over the ruins but has been frustrated by the courts. Although the elections of 2004 gave a negative verdict on the BJP government, it remains the major opposition party and controls state governments in some key states, including, today, Gujarat. So now to the more general issues. For several years, I've been studying the Gujarat violence, its basis and its aftermath, looking for its implications for the ways in which we should view religious violence around the world. One obvious conclusion to draw is that each case must be studied on its own merits, with close attention to specific historical and regional factors. The idea that all conflicts are explained by a simple hypothesis of a clash of civilizations proves utterly inadequate to the facts of Gujarat, where European ideas, borrowed to address a perceived weakness in the Hindu male character, were used to create an ideology that has ultimately led to a great deal of violence against peaceful Muslims. Indeed, the Clash of Civilizations thesis is the best friend of these perpetrators because it shields them and their ideology from close scrutiny. Repeatedly, as I've conducted interviews with leading members of this group, I've been informed that as an American, no doubt, I was already on their side because I would know that Muslims stir up trouble wherever they are and that there's nothing for it but to be prepared to take reactive and even preemptive measures against them. What we see in Gujarat is not that simplistic, comforting thesis. It is something much more disturbing. The fact that in a thriving democracy, many individuals are unable to live with others who are different on terms of mutual respect and amity. They seek total domination as the only route to security and pride. This is a phenomenon that's well known in democracies around the world, and it has nothing to do with an alleged Muslim monolith, and really very little to do with religion as such. I've already noted that the Hindu right is bent on recasting Hinduism into a newly violent and monolithic form. This case, then, informs us that we must look within, asking whether in our own society similar forces are at work, and if so, how we may counteract them. Beyond that general insight, however, my study of the riots suggests 4 very specific lessons. Number 1, the rule of law. One of the most appalling aspects of Gujarat was the complicity of officers of the law. Police sat on their hands and indeed were ordered to do so on penalty of demotion or transfer. The highest officials of state government, prominently including Narendra Modi, egged on the killing. The national government gave aid and comfort to the state government. The worst aspect of the unequal status of Muslims in Gujarat was this inequality before the law. Muslims at present in that state are not fully equal citizens. The institutions of government broke down at the local level and to some extent at the national level. However, the institutional and legal structure of the Indian democracy ultimately proved robust, playing a key role in securing justice for the victims. The Supreme Court and the National Electoral Commission played very constructive roles in postponing new elections while Muslims were still afraid to return to their homes, and in ordering changes of venue in key trials arising out of the violence. Above all, there were free national elections in 2004, and these elections, in which the participation of poor rural voters was decisive, delivered a strongly negative verdict on the policies of fear and hate, as well as on the BJP's economic policies. The current government, headed by Manmohan Singh, who's India's first minority prime minister, has announced a firm commitment to ending sectarian violence and has done a great deal to focus attention on the unequal economic and political situation of Muslims in the nation, as well as appointing Muslims to high offices. On balance, then, the pluralistic democracy envisaged by Gandhi and Nehru seems to be winning, in part because the framers had bequeathed to India a wise institutional and constitutional structure and traditions of commitment to the key political values this structure embodies. It should be mentioned that one of the key aspects of the founders' commitment, which so far has survived the Hindu right challenge, is the general conception of the nation and its unity as a unity around political ideals and values, particularly the value of equal entitlement, rather than around ethnic or religious or linguistic identity. India, like the United States, but unlike most of the nations of Europe, has rejected such exclusionary ways of characterizing the nation, adopting in its constitution, in public ceremonies and in key public symbols, the political conception of national unity. India's national anthem, words and music composed by Rabindranath Tagore, is a paean to pluralism. It mentions the diverse ethno-geographical origins of Indians and praises the fact that all alike show reverence to the moral law. This public commitment to pluralism is continually contested by the Hindu right, who prefer a different candidate for the national anthem, which is warlike and exclusionary. So far, however, the founders' strategy is held firm. Political structure is not everything, but it can supply a great deal in times of stress. Number 2, the press and the role of intellectuals. One of the heartening aspects of Gujarat was the performance of the national media and the community of intellectuals. Both print media and television kept up unceasing pressure to document and investigate the riots, and the role of key government officials was documented beyond doubt. At the same time, because the local police were not doing their job, Many scholars, lawyers, and NGO leaders converged on Gujarat to take down the testimony of witnesses, help women who were raped file complaints, and so on, and in short, to prepare a public record that would stand up in court. The intellectual community has easier access to the national press in India than in the US, in part thanks to the somewhat greater financial independence of the national media. And these intellectuals seized their opportunity, producing a wonderful outpouring of trenchant and high-quality analysis. The only reason I felt the need to write about these events further myself is that these analyses have by and large not reached US audiences. We can see here documentation of something long ago observed by Amartya Sen in the context of famine, the crucial role of a free press in supporting democratic institutions. And we can study here what freedom of the press really means. I would argue that it requires a certain absence of top-down corporate control of the press and an easy access to major media by intellectual voices from a wide range of backgrounds. We in the US need to take note. Third, education, the importance of critical thinking and imagination. So far, I've mentioned factors that have helped the Indian democracy survive the threat of a quasi-fascist takeover. Now we move to warning signs for the future, areas in which the democracy is currently weak and vulnerable. The public schools of the state of Gujarat are famous for their complete lack of critical thinking, their exclusive emphasis on rote learning, and the uncritical learning of marketable skills, and the elements of fascist propaganda that easily creep in when critical thinking is not cultivated. It is well known that Hitler is presented as a hero in history textbooks in the state of Gujarat, and nationwide public protest has not yet led to any change. To some extent, the rest of the nation is better off than Gujarat. National-level textbooks have been rewritten to take out the false ideological view of history loved by the Hindu right, and to substitute a much more nuanced view of history. Nonetheless, the emphasis on rote learning and on regurgitation for national examinations is distressing everywhere, and things are only becoming worse with the immense pressure to produce economically productive graduates. The educational culture of India used to contain great progressive voices, such as Tagore, who emphasized that all the skills in the world were useless and even baneful, if not wielded by a cultivated imagination and by refined critical faculties. Currently, such voices have been silenced by the sheer demand for profitability in the global market. Parents want their children to learn marketable skills, and their great pride is the admission of a child to the Indian Institutes of Technology and Management. They, by and large, have contempt for the humanities and the arts. I fear for democracy down the road when it is run, as it increasingly will be unless things change, by docile engineers in the Gujarat mold, unable to criticize the propaganda of politicians and unable to imagine the pain of another human being. This is no humorous topic, but it can be illustrated by an odd story from my experience investigating the Gujarati community in the United States, where, in fact, fully 40% of our Indian Americans hail from the state of Gujarat. A large proportion of Gujarati Hindus belong to the Swami Narayan sect of Hinduism, distinctive for its emphasis on uncritical obedience to the utterances of the current head of the sect, whose title is Pramukh Swami. On a visit to the elaborate multi-million-dollar Swami Narayan temple in Bartlett, Illinois, it's a suburb of Chicago, I was given a tour by a young man recently arrived from Gujarat who delighted in telling me the simplistic Hindu right-wing story of India's history, and who emphatically told me that whatever Pramukh Swami says is to be regarded as the direct voice of God and is to be obeyed without question. At this point, with a beatific smile, this young man pointed up to the elaborate carved marble ceiling of the temple and asked, "Do you know why this ceiling glows the way it does?" I said I didn't, and I confidently expected an explanation invoking the spiritual powers of Pramukh Swami. My guide smiled even more broadly. "Fiber optic cables," he said. "We are the first ones to put this technology into a temple." Now here you see what can easily wreck a democracy, a combination of technological sophistication with utter mental docility. I fear that many democracies around the world, including our own, are going down this road, through a lack of emphasis on the humanities and arts and an unbalanced emphasis on profitable skills. Number 4, the creation of a liberal public culture. How did fascism take such a hold in India. Hindu traditions emphasize tolerance and pluralism, and daily life in India, as in New York, tends to emphasize the ferment and vigor of difference as people from so many different ethnic, linguistic, and regional backgrounds jostle against one another. But the traditions contain a wound, a locus of vulnerability, and I would locate this wound in the area of humiliated masculinity. For centuries, many Hindu males think they have been subordinated, laughed at, treated as weak by this sequence of conquerors. The fact that the British really did despise Hinduism and Hindu males, calling their religion a beastly religion, surely made matters worse, and Hindus came to identify the sexual playfulness and sensuousness of their traditions, scorned by the masters of the Raj, with their own weakness and subjection. So, a repudiation of the sensuous and the cultivation of the masculinity, typified by Tagore's image of the British military band, came to seem the best way out of this subjection. One reason why the RSS attracts such a following is this widespread sense of masculine failure, a key aspect of the rhetoric of both Savarkar and Golwalkar, and of RSS shakas in every part of India today. At the same time, the RSS filled a void, organizing at the grassroots level with great discipline and selflessness. The RSS is not just about fascist organizing. It also provides needed social services, and it provides fun, luring boys in with the promise of a group life that has both more solidarity and more imagination than the tedious role of the government schools. Golwalkar said that if he saw a peacock in his garden and wanted it to become his pet, he would feed it little bits of opium every day until it became addicted, and that way it would be sure to come to his garden every day. He said this was how the shakas work. By the lure of fun and games, they make boys obedient members of the organization. So what is needed is some counter-force, which would supply a public culture of pluralism with equally efficient grassroots organization and a public culture of masculinity that would contend against the appeal of the warlike and rapacious masculinity purveyed by the Hindu right. The clash within is not so much a clash between two groups in a nation who are different from birth. It is at bottom a clash within each person, in which the ability to live with others on terms of mutual respect and equality contends anxiously against the sense of being humiliated and the desire to dominate. Gandhi understood this very, very well. During his lifetime, his powerful movement did purvey a counter-image to the images of domineering masculinity. He taught his followers that life's real struggle was a struggle within the self, against one's own need to dominate and one's fear of being vulnerable. He deliberately focused attention on sexuality as an arena in which domination plays itself out with pernicious effect, and he deliberately cultivated an androgynous, maternal persona. I think that in some respects he went off the tracks in his suggestion that sexual relations are inherently scenes of domination, and in his recommendation of asceticism as the only route to non-domination. Nonetheless, he saw the problem at its root, and he proposed a public culture that while he lived was sufficient to address it. His followers understood that being a real man does not mean emulating British aggressiveness and learning to bash others. It meant having the courage not to bash others, to stand up to aggression with nothing but one's own naked human dignity around one. In the process, he won the respect of the entire world for India's men and their traditions. In a quite different way, Rabindranath Tagore also created a counter-image of the male Indian self, an image that was more sensuous and more joyful than that of Gandhi, but equally bent on renouncing the domination that Tagore saw as inherent in European traditions. After Gandhi, however, this part of the pluralist program has languished. Much though he loved and admired both Gandhi and Tagore, Nehru had contempt for religion, and out of his contempt he neglected the cultivation of that which the radical religions of both men, Tagore and Gandhi, had supplied, namely images of who we are as citizens, symbolic connections to the roots of human vulnerability and openness, and the creation of a grassroots public culture around such symbols. Nehru was a great institution builder, but in thinking about the public culture of the new nation, his focus was always on economic, not cultural factors. Because he firmly expected that raising the economic level of the poor would cause them to lose the need for religion and in general for a culture of emotional nourishment, He saw no need to provide a counterforce to the powerful emotional propaganda of the Hindu right. Today's young people in India, therefore, tend to think of religion and symbolic culture creation in general as forces that are in their very nature fascist and reactionary, because that is what they have seen in their experience. When one tells them the story of the U.S. civil rights movement and the role of both liberal religion and powerful pluralist rhetoric in forging an anti-racist civic culture, they're quite surprised. Meanwhile, the RSS, which understands human psychology rather well, goes to work unopposed in every state and region, skillfully plucking the strings of hatred and fear. By now, pluralists generally realize that a mistake was made in leaving grassroots organization to the right, but it's very difficult to jumpstart a pluralist movement. The salient exception has actually been the women's movement, which has built very successfully at the grassroots level with the regional knowledge, the mixture of economic and cultural incentives, and the respect for the imagination that such a movement requires. It is comforting for Americans to talk about a clash of civilizations. This thesis tells us that evil is outside, distant, other, and that we are perfectly all right as we are. All we need to do is to stay true to ourselves and fight the good fight. But the case of Gujarat shows us that the world is very different from the world that comforting fable depicts. The forces that assail democracy are internal to many, if not most, democratic nations. And they are not foreign. They are our own ideas and voices, meaning the voices of aggressive European nationalism, refracted back against the original aggressor with the extra bite of resentment born of a long experience of domination and humiliation. The implication of this idea is that all nations, Western and non-Western, need to examine themselves with the most fearless exercise of the critical capacities, looking for the roots of domination within, and devising effective institutional and educational countermeasures. At a deeper level, the case of Gujarat shows us what Gandhi and Tagore, in their different ways, knew very well, that the real root of domination lies deep in the human personality, in the narcissistic desire to lord it over others, and to efface the inconvenient challenge posed by the other, in wounded masculinity that cannot rest until it has destroyed the source of its own perceived wound. It would be so convenient if Americans were pure and free from flaw, but we can now see that the very fantasy of purity is yet another form that the resourceful narcissism of the human personality takes on the way to bad behavior. Looking at the clash this way, as an internal clash, we will naturally focus on my 4 strategies for the preservation and enhancement of democracies around the world. First, on getting institutional structures that can remain firm against fascist challenges. Second, on bolstering the independence, including prominently the economic independence of the press and the free speech of intellectuals. Third, on creating educational institutions that teach the skills of critical thinking and imagining that are so crucial for the health of democracy. And finally, what Martin Luther King Jr. learned from Gandhi, creating a public culture of non-domination and equality that can inspire fearful human beings, for all of us are fearful, with the idea that comfort is to be found in mutual aid, equality, and reciprocity, not in the quick and dirty victory over an enemy onto whom we have all too conveniently projected our own fears.
Professor Nussbaum has agreed to take a few questions. Could we have the lights on in the auditorium? We have microphones.
Yeah, we have
and she has asked that the first few questions be from students. And so could I honor that request, please? The first few questions be from students.
And they should go to the microphones, right? Where are the microphones?
Correct. The microphones are against the wall.
See, if the students don't speak up, we'll be sitting waiting for quite a long time. So you better, might as well get it over. Ah, here's one. Here's a student here.
said that the best thing we can do is provide, you said, more value for the humanities and the arts, right? Okay. Yes, can you hear me?
That's better. Yeah, it's on. It's on, but you have to...
So you said that the best thing we can do is provide more chances for, or value for the humanities and the arts, but if you look at the priorities of the United Nations, so it's always economic, so I mean, how can we start if it's all centered on what is it, the World Trade Organization or things like that? So.
Well, of course, I mean, a lot of organizations around the world are emphasizing technological development, and I would say it's not wrong to emphasize that as one part of what nations should do. What is wrong is to say that that's the only part and that it's sufficient to build democratic citizens on its own. Now, I think it's not primarily the UN that's peddling this false view. Look at the Spellings Commission report on higher education, where there's focus entirely on the future of technology and a certain kind of low-level science, and nothing about the humanities. Well, there are countermeasures. The Association of American Colleges and Universities has published an excellent report about a month ago, and there are national discussions going on about that now, about the values that should be promoted in higher education. In the lower years, of course, we're lucky to have local autonomy, I think, because nothing that the nation wants to do can do too much damage at the grassroots level. But then that means the struggle has to be fought in each community, and that it really does have to be fought. I think that, my sense is that the U.S. still has fairly robust traditions of Dewey-style, imagination-based education at the elementary school level, and it's as the upper grades, the higher up you go in high school, the pressure for success, piling on the work and so on, makes things worse and worse. But it's not too far gone to rescue, and I think we just have to realize that these are not useless frills that you can cut away to get on with the real business of education. They're essential skills for the future of democracy. And I think, every nation needs to learn that. I think we really need much more international conversation, international communication about it, and but we better start at home by making sure that the good things that we have don't go under.
Yeah, I just have a question. There's several Indian students here on campus, and as you talk to students and people who are from India, it seems like they try to avoid talking about the caste system. And I know that one of Gandhi's objectives was to eliminate the Dalit and to have everyone be seen as the children of God, as he called them. Is there ever really going to be an end of the caste system in India, and if so, how will that be accomplished?
Well, I think it's a question that's not dissimilar to the question about race in America. That is, where there's a legacy of great hatred and subordination, it's very, very difficult to get rid of that through law and public policy. Now, certainly from independence on, discrimination on the basis of caste is illegal, and any observance of caste in the Constitution itself is ruled out. However, on the social level, these things still go on, and people are keenly, even when they don't discriminate, they're keenly aware of caste. Now then, as happens here, that's produced the natural reaction, namely that we have to have affirmative action measures for the lower castes, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. So right after independence, there were introduced mandatory quotas in public employment and for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, and also reservations and quotas. The reservations is the Indian word Indian use for quotas. Reservations in Parliament. Then the next lower group of castes, the so-called other backward castes or OBCs, got very upset because now they were at the bottom of the heap and they couldn't get any of these perquisites that were reserved for the others. they were not suffering in the same way. So their claim was unclear whether they had a legitimate claim. But in any case, they did win, ultimately, reservations in public employment and in higher education. There's recently been an increase in the number of places in higher education that's been under reservation. Now, see, that has worked in a complicated way. Of course, I think it was necessary to break the grip of caste discrimination. There's absolutely no doubt of that. But once you introduce quotas, you can't get out of them, and they accentuate the feature of caste. Political parties are now based on caste. A lot of the political organization in India is not along ideological or class lines, but rather along caste lines. And now you just get more and more demands, so that the number of seats that are actually frozen into some kind of quota gets larger and larger. So the result is the middle class is very, very unhappy with this. There's a lot of internal division, and in higher education, there's particular unhappiness because it's such an important passport to the future. You feel it is particularly naked kind of quota giving because just one score determines your place, and so it's very clear how the scores are being upped for the people from the lower caste. So there's tremendous resentment, and that exacerbates caste tensions. So I think right now the situation is not good, and you do see even very well-meaning and decent people feeling that in the end affirmative action has been a failure. What is the solution? It's very hard to know. I mean, I do think that ideally the solution would be getting away from the single number and having something much more like a system that the U.S. has, where you have many different values considered in the admissions process. Whether such a system is administrable in India, large as it is, and with the possibility of corruption is unclear. So I think it's an issue that's very, very difficult. And all I can say is right now the situation has made some progress in the sense that Dalits are leading intellectuals, leading professors, leading politicians, but yet the social reality of caste is still very deep.
I very much enjoyed your presentation, but I wonder to what extent, at the time of Indian independence, the creation of Pakistan and India did not legitimate in some way, in a formal way, that the separation was a good thing, and that particularly complicated the issue by creating even a smaller minority of Muslims, so that this actually cast a shadow that would strengthen the Hindu right decades later.
Yeah, well, this is a very complicated historical issue. We're certainly not going to get to the bottom of it here, but I do think I don't have a very rosy view of Jinnah. I think Jinnah was the founder of Pakistan, and he was a very Europeanized person who had no contact with the economic or daily realities of the lives of Indians in the way that both Gandhi and Nehru did. And he was a very narcissistic person in many ways, and I think he decided that rather than throw in his lot with the Congress Party and be part of a complex whole, as many Muslims have been doing, including prominently Maulana Azad, he would rather lead a breakaway movement and encourage Muslims to think that they couldn't live in this united India. And so when he started talking about Pakistan, it wasn't clear that he really meant a separate state. He probably meant separate electorates for Muslims or something like that. But then the British came into it. And the British always had the idea that dividing and ruling was a good thing to do. And so they egged on this idea that there should be two states. And of course they haven't yet thought that either one of them should be an independent state. So, bad went from bad to worse. And so I do think that many people not only think that that gives comfort to the thought that India is for the Hindus, but also bear the scars of resentment from the terrible violence that erupted at partition on both sides. So, yes, that is a problem. But the fact is the Muslims who are in India now are very, very numerous. As I said, it's the third largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia and Pakistan. It's close to the population of Pakistan. I mean, it's so close that it goes back and forth between being the second and the third largest Muslim population. So you have to remember there are as many Muslims in India today, basically, as are in Pakistan, and they are democratic citizens. They chose not to go to Pakistan. They are living their lives in India, and they are really thoroughly integrated into the regions where they live. So to portray them, as the Hindu right likes to do, as a fifth column who are always spying for Pakistan is just ridiculous. And they really can't get away with it, but they do try.
Well, since you mentioned Hinduism several times as a religion, may I say that Hinduism is not a religion. It has no one prophet. It has no one holy book. They don't proselytize. They don't sermonize or evangelize. Everybody, they are. You mentioned about RSS and Hindu Mahasabha, but I did not hear anything about the Muslim League and other organizations which promote the cause of Islam at the cost of Christians and Hindus and Buddhists in India. Islam is a foreign religion. It was introduced by the invaders who came from Turkey and Arabia. And people who embraced Islam, or Islam was imposed on them, they did it to avoid the taxes, the jizya. You're talking about violence in Gujarat, that's more recent origin. I did not hear anything about the violence that went on in Bengal and Punjab. And it is those two states which were divided because Muslims wanted their own state. Pakistan and Bangladesh does not have any minority. There are 15-20%. Today there may be 1%. You talk about Godse. He has his book, which was not allowed by the Hindus, Mr. Nehru, to publish. Now it is available. And you can read that book to see what Mr. Godse thought about what Mr. Gandhi did, as long as he was the so-called father of nations. I am surprised that you say that India is quasi-fascist. There is no quasi-fascism. India had never any slaves. They did not kill the natives coming from another country. India is distinguished in the sense that they had a woman prime minister. Right now, the head of the state, Sonia Gandhi, is a foreigner, or she is now naturalized. She is the president of the ruling party. The prime minister represents 2% of the people of India, Manmohan Singh, and the president of India is a Muslim. I can go on and on. You had your 1 hour and 30 minutes.
Okay, but there are a number of points that you've raised, so I don't know whether I'm not going to be able to deal with all the points that you've raised, but there's one thing that you said that I want to start with. You said that Godse's book was banned by the Hindus. No, actually, it was banned by the Congress Party government, and I think it's very important that the Congress Party was an integrated party that included Muslims in very high positions of power. It included people from all the major religions, but very prominently Maulana Azad and other Muslims. So it wasn't the case that this book was banned by Hindus. Now, as to the Muslim League, those in the audience who don't know what that is, I had just been talking about Jinnah and my own disapproval of his actions. The Muslim League was the, in effect, breakaway Muslim movement founded by Jinnah, and I've already said that I disapprove of the choices that he made at that time, and I think there was a lot of personal ego involved in those choices. On the other hand, though, what we have to say, once again, is that the Muslims who are in India today are the ones who were not going to Pakistan, and they are just as numerous as the ones in Pakistan. I didn't mention organizations that stir up Muslims to hate Christians and Hindus in India because I don't believe there are any. There are certainly terrorist groups in Kashmir, and no one would deny that. And the terrorist groups who are concerned with Kashmiri separatism are funded from Pakistan in many cases, and they do stir up trouble not only in Kashmir but in other parts of India as well. So Kashmir is a separate matter. It is a terrible situation, and I'm abstracting from that in the bulk of what I'm saying. But apart from that case, the fact is that Muslims are citizens of every state in India. They work alongside alongside Hindus. They are just normal democratic citizens. There are many problems in that community, as the recent government report on the status of Muslims in India has shown. And one of their problems is economic disadvantage. In every state, Muslims are doing worse than Hindus, except, interestingly, Gujarat. Now, it's actually very interesting, because Gujarat is the one state that Muslims are not doing on balance worse than Hindus, and the reason is that Gujarat has long had a large trader, merchant Muslim class. So I think this is part of the background of the violence that is comparable to the resentment of the Jews in Europe, that there were prosperous Muslims who were perceived as taking jobs away from Hindus, and the resentment against them was all the keener on that account. But in any case, Muslims suffer tremendous economic disadvantage. They also have problems internal to the community. There's a lot of debate about what the nature of Muslim family law should be. Feminist Muslims don't like what the Muslim Personal Law Board does on balance, and they think it's a very democratic and unrepresentative group. On the other hand, there's been a large sociological survey of Muslim women in India, the only largest such survey ever conducted by Zoya Hassan and Ritu Memon, which has shown that Muslim women on the whole favor strongly education for both sons and daughters, but that very often their daughters get educational advantages relative to the boys that are more than are the case in Hindu families in the same region. The reason being that in many, many Hindu families, the perception is, and the reality also is, that boys have better job opportunities than girls. And so if you want one of your children to do well, you'll send the boy to school and not you'll keep the girl at home. But Muslims have such bad job opportunities in general that it doesn't work out that way, and so then the girl gets a slight break as a result, because they think, well, the boy doesn't have any opportunities anyway, and we might as well send the girl to school. So Muslim girls are actually doing pretty well relative to Hindu girls in respect of education. So anyway, those are just some of the issues you mentioned, and obviously I wasn't saying anything bad about the nation of India. In fact, it's a nation that I deeply love, and I think its pluralism is fantastic, and that so far it has surmounted this assault of fascist ideas. I call them fascist because they were deliberately and explicitly borrowed from the European fascists. That's where they came from. And Golwalkar, as you can see, makes no bones about it. Today they do find that rather embarrassing, but there it is in black and white.
Why the Gujarat state had more problem for the Muslims than other states in India?
Oh, you're asking? Well, it's a very long story. I mean, I talked to a lot of people in Gujarat, and I heard many different things. I think one thing, of course, you have to mention the fact that it's states in the north that have this memory of the violence of partition. States in the south, by and large, there's much less of this religious polarization. Also, it's in the north that the RSS has organized. I mean, it was based in Maharashtra, it spread out from there throughout all the states in the north. It's always had a very weak hold in the south. They keep saying, oh, you Dravidian people, remember that you used to speak Sanskrit too, But this is obviously false. These people have completely different history and traditions, and they don't fall so much for the propaganda of the Hindu right. So there are those two things. Then there's the fact that the Congress Party in Gujarat has a very distinctive history. It was never really Nehruvian. Nehru had a very weak influence in the state of Gujarat, and the Congress Party in Gujarat, dominated by the Patels and with their own particular class interests, they were always soft on communalism, on religious violence, and they didn't discourage it in the way that the Nehruvians did. Then there's the education, and for many years, Gujarati schools have been well known for having no critical thinking and having a lot of technical skills without critical thinking. And then, as I say, there's also the fact that the Muslims are threatening in Gujarat in a way that they're, in other states they seem nearly downtrodden and weak, and in Gujarat, because many of them are wealthy and powerful, they seem to pose more of a threat. So I think all of those factors are involved, But then, of course, it needs to be orchestrated, and what the RSS has done is to very carefully orchestrate this kind of violence by careful preparation over long periods of time, and by making sure that high-ranking officials of government are part of it. If you want to just see a kind of not very good but pop version of these events, there's a Bollywood movie called Dave, D-E-V, about the good cop and the bad cop, basically, the chief of police who tells his subordinate to not stop the rioting, and this guy who's played by Amitabh Bachchan and therefore is very sympathetic has a conscience, and so he won't do that, and then his friend has him killed, and so on. So, I mean, you get a picture of the situation from that, namely the infiltration of deliberate organization toward violence all through the police is very, very clear there. Now, what the movie really is bad about is that it shows that Hindus and Muslims both have these terrorist organizations in equal measure, whereas there's actually, in Gujarat, as I said, we don't know anything about an organized attempt by Muslims to butcher Hindus, and there just isn't any organization of that sort.
Well, when I was sitting here, you saw that I had something, an excerpt from an early book of yours, Love's Knowledge. You said, this is a different topic. And I said, well, it'll be the same topic. And so I want to address that. I mean, that's in the sense that you begin that book with some statements, an excerpt from Proust, in which the statement is, Proust is talking about how there's been deriding of style by those who want to see the theorists or the area of content as being more intellectually sophisticated, whereas in fact the vision of the individual is what style embodies. And so anyway, in light of that, what I take from your talk is the deep analysis of the threatened masculinity, which is the root, that is really what fascism comes out of, in a sense. You need to react to that. And I feel that what I learned in India, when I was there was an amazing ability on the social level. I agree fully with your analysis politically. The sociological, I was amazed at how, with the variety of classes and types, people did accept. And so, I feel in society, the categorizations of all professions, not just humanities versus sciences, whatever, is categorical slots, which in light of your comment in Love's Knowledge, creates a sense of content here as opposed to individual style, tends to create a kind of autistic reaction among people that can't fit personality into that. It begins at early education. That root of violence, how can that be addressed? Oh, that's my question. How can that be addressed in terms of that categorization of all professions versus vis-a-vis the person who doesn't ever fit those slots, which in this society creates all kinds of problems from serial killers onward. Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Long.
Well, I guess the way I would put the point, I mean, I do take the point that I'm the same person and there's a connection of themes here, is that the founders, the Nehru in particular, I mean, Nehru, not Gandhi, but Nehru focused on the creation of institutional and political structure and economic structure. And he did not focus on the what we call style, I mean, on the spirit and the symbolism. And I think he was a little skeptical of that aspect of Gandhi as being too much connected with Gandhi's religiosity. So, therefore, after Gandhi's death, a void was left, and there was no leadership for a nonviolent movement or a new way to conceive of the democratic self that was strong in virtue of not trying to lord it over others. I mean, see, I think anyone who hasn't seen Richard Attenborough's wonderful Gandhi movie should do so. What you see there is the tremendous reversal in perceptions of who's a strong man and who isn't. When they go to the salt works and they're marching up 4 by 4 and the British soldiers are bashing them down, then 4 more come. naked, with only their dignity to guard them. They come up and they get bashed down. And, you know, the eyes of the world are watching. And who looks like a strong man and who looks like a weak man there? Well, it's perfectly obvious. And so it was that kind of leadership in reformulating the sense that strength consists in the willingness to be an equal and not lord it over others. I think Nehru did that as a personal individual, and he did it extremely well. That's one reason that India is a great nation and Pakistan has been plagued with problems ever since, because Nehru was not corrupt, because he left a legacy of selflessness and devotion, but he didn't really know how to construct grassroots movements, and maybe he just thought that was a matter that the different states should do for themselves. But in any case, it didn't happen, and in education, his focus was really on industrialization and building up technological skills, as that needed to happen. But I think the fact is that when you don't focus on other things too, those things drop away as the things that Tagore stood for: the imagination, the critical faculties, the awakening of the child's curiosity. Those things have been very much neglected. Well, I'd rather not even say masculinism. I would rather say a certain style of aggressive masculinity that responds to a perceived humiliation. I mean, I think this is something that you have to look at with each cultural case one by one. I mean, you can only understand it, the particular Indian formation of this, against the background of a history where Krishna is sensuously playing the flute and lounging around on the grass and dallying with the cowherds, and suddenly then the British come along and say, you disgusting and disgraceful people, how could you behave like that? And then people react against that, and there's the general humiliation of being a subject, but there's the more specific humiliation of having your sexuality and your masculinity abused and insulted. So, you know, I think all of these things are very culturally specific, but I do also think you can find parallels, and in my book I do mention the case of the Klaus Taylor's book Male Fantasies, or Männer Fantasien, which is the study of the memoirs of German officers after the First World War. That's another case where there's a deep humiliation, and there's a sense of how can we be men after this humiliation, and there's a similar desire to extinguish and extirpate all that's soft, all that's sensuous, all that's perceived as feminine. So that is a parallel that I think is useful. The religious right in America, I really don't know what to say about that. I think there's no comparable cataclysm that has made them feel, you know, our masculinity has been robbed, and we've been living in subjection. Now we must somehow rise up and avenge ourselves. So it's different historically, and I think therefore the accent on extinguishing all that's receptive and playful in the personality isn't quite as militant, but I also just haven't studied it enough, and so I don't know what I would say. I mean, I think those are all good questions to raise about it, certainly.
Thank you. I trust all of you know that this is one of many wonderful, thoughtful, insightful, challenging talks that is part of this conference on violence and values. It will pick up again tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., 8:30 a.m. in the Officers Club. And I would like to remind you that at noon tomorrow, we will have the Barbara Norman Tanner inaugural lecture with Professor Amartya Sen in the Libby Gardner Hall down the President's Circle. And we hope to see all of you there. Thank you for coming. Good night.